Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, unfortunately, I am doing this alone this week because my good co host, GSP, has been recalled back to the Kremlin to await further instructions for how our overlords want to take direction of the show. Look, we had Vile Varangian on, that was great, it was a lot of fun, and we thought he gave us ample instruction, but apparently the higher ups are saying, no, no, no. We need even more from you. We need to talk to one of you directly. And naturally, I sent the Slav over. I'm not going over there. Look, I'm not saying I'm that swarthy, but I think I'm a touch too swarthy for Russia. It just comes being a med. But that is all aside the point, and we shall get into the stories of the week. We have quite a few. It's probably going to be a shorter show. There's not much to bounce off of, so I'm probably going to breeze through them faster than usual. So if I miss any details, my apologies in advance, but starting naturally with an overview of Syria. So the main stories these week out of Syria are particularly in Daraa in the southwest and of course towards Idlib in the northwest. Now, towards Idlib, the desire for a status quo that Turkey expressed to Russia has been more or less, those dreams have been dashed, which I'm not surprised. That's sort of what I was expecting. We've seen this pattern play over and over and over again since 2018 at least. And Russian, Syrian, and pro government forces have continued their shelling, have continued their gradual push into Idlib, into northwestern Syria. So that is continuing on as usual. There are very heavy Russian airstrikes in the province right now, and again, it looks like the opportune time that Assad and his allies are taking to push into Idlib at this point, because there's really no better time to do it than now when it seems like the entire world order has been put on its head, which I'll get into some of the stuff later when it comes to just frankly every story we have this week really reflects that theme, just to put that out there. But also in Syria, what we have is in southwest Syria, in Daraa, there's been a series of attacks on the police, on other officers, on other security forces, which has prompted, due to the breaking of the ceasefires, Russian military police and Russian forces to move in and act as something of a peacekeeper, act something that is restoring order. And you also have this week the Syrian foreign minister coming out telling Turkey that we will not accept the loss of any parts of our land. And of course, Erdogan has been doing his usual routine this week with just his actions are not to be of a surprise to anyone. And even according to this headline from South Front, Erdogan has single handedly exposed the frailties of NATO unity. Now, this is more of an overview piece. It was still pretty good. I recommend that you look into it if you get the chance, but again, you do have Turkey pushing further on the Kurdish question, as you can see on the map this week, with Turkish forces moving in to northeastern Syria further. Of course, that's, I wouldn't exactly say gain the ire of, because it's a bit too strong language, but it has been off-putting to the usual suspects, to the Western powers. And really, things just keep on going the way they've been going in Syria for about the past year now. And you also have some infighting, and you can tell the pressure starting to be applied to Idlib, because you still have remnants of ISIS forces in Idlib at this point, with HTS having claimed to arrest them. Now, whether they're actually ISIS, whether they're part of some other group, point being is this has been an ongoing trend in Idlib where you have a lot of these groups that are just caving in on each other, that are turning on each other as the pressure sets in, as victory becomes more and more apparent on the Russian and Syrian side, and defeat becomes more and more apparent on the opposition side. And that's just a general overview of Syria. Now, getting into other Middle Eastern news, with the pressure in the Caucasus and Nagorno Karabakh, with particularly Iran's moves right now. Tensions have escalated markedly between them and Azerbaijan. Now, you have to recall that Azerbaijan is, ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, a very pro Western, pro Israeli regime, and they've in fact actually allowed the Mossad to operate in, I believe it was Nagorno Karabakh itself, but in Azerbaijan in general, which of course that is Israeli intelligence right on their doorstep, right on the Iranian doorstep, which has led to this very strange, again, politics, war, make strange bedfellows, this very strange alliance of convenience, if you will, between Iran and Azerbaijan, who I'm not saying are the worst of any historically. It certainly doesn't compare to what the Armenians and the Turks have felt about each other, but Armenia and Iran haven't been a brotherly people, so to speak, and it is still interesting to watch all this play out, and of course unfolding under the Russian and also you could say Chinese spheres, this Eurasian landmass, if you will, that they would like to fearmonger about, that they would like to inform us is going to take over the world and somehow destroy the West more than it's already destroying itself, but that's aside the point. And what you have now is the continuing trend of Iranian forces conducting drills, conducting practices, conducting just build-ups in general on the Azeri border. And this, of course, includes everything from your rank and file infantry, special forces, armored units, as well as fighters, helicopters, missile systems. And they actually gave the operation the name, quote, Conquerors of Khaybar, which is in reference to, of course, Muhammad and the battle against the Jews in 628. So, very, pardon the pun, on the nose with how they're approaching Azerbaijan and what they're more or less saying about them. And it was interesting because you have Turkey at the same time conducting their military operations with the Azeris and calling it Indestructible Brotherhood 2021, I guess trying to build that real pan-Turkic coalition, which has been somewhat of a pipe dream of more, I would say, hardline Turkish nationalists over the past few years. Of course, the ideas are much older than a few years, but it seems that they've really regained popularity since then. Now, it's unlikely that Iran and Azerbaijan will actually trade blows, that this will actually boil over into some sort of ethnic conflict, because you do have to consider Iran is home to a large portion of both ethnic Azeris and ethnic Armenians, in which case, if they get too entrenched in a conflict like that, and again, shooting war hasn't even started between in Nagorno-Karabakh yet. Not since the tentative peace treaty last year have you seen any real fighting. Now, there's been skirmishes, there's been raising of tensions, there's been what looks like it's going to break out to fighting, and if we're being honest, it's a question of when rather than if, but it hasn't done that yet, and Iran getting into any sort of heavy exchange with either, especially the Azeris, because although in Iran proper their numbers are smaller, from my understanding, now correct me if I'm wrong if I have any Iran experts out there, they're a much more cohesive community and are much more in touch with their home country, so to speak, whereas the Armenians, not only in Iran but worldwide, are a diasporic people similar to, you could say, the Jews up until the 20th century, up until the establishment of Israel, and even still to this day, where magnitudes more of them live outside the borders of their homeland than they do in Armenia. There's, I think, Armenia's total population is only a couple of million, whereas there's millions upon millions that used to be, of course, in what was once Western Armenia and Turkey before World War One and the Armenian genocide, etc. There's plenty of them in the Levant in greater Syria, if you will. That's Syria proper, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, etc. Of course, several places in the West, Russia, the United States, etc. Very diasporic people is what I'm getting at, and that could be used to their advantage. I mean, they have political lobbies nowhere near the way that AIPAC or the Zionist lobbies operate, but they do exist, and you do see them exert their influence even in the run up to the 2020 election. You did see this with Trump making some passing comments about the Armenians, Biden coming into office saying, "Oh, we want to work out a solution here." But it hasn't quite boiled over, but it looks like Iran is really trying to take a lead role in this crisis and trying to really assert themselves and assert their interests, and not waiting, not reacting, which I would say makes sense, especially for a country on their border that's so close to Israel, that is tentatively close to so many Western powers. And you already have, again, Iranian military trucks moving into Yerevan, which is the capital of Armenia. Of course, they're officially non lethal, and I don't believe that they're participating in any sort of arms trade or training. I believe that these are probably just, again, non lethal aid trucks in regard to the entire conflict. But that's certainly something to keep your eye on. Certainly a big developing story coming out of the Middle East right now. But speaking of Iran, this is a hell of a story with what has been happening lately, and this isn't exclusive to Iran. This is more of a worldwide phenomenon that had been ongoing for quite a few years now, but has really ramped up over the past year now. There has been several reports out of virtually every mainstream media outlet you can think of, just to put that in perspective, about the absurd amount of CIA agents and assets abroad, particularly with Iran and China, that have been either turned into double agents or completely liquidated. Now, of course, a lot of it, especially with Iran, relies on the people we have on the ground, the dissidents that we recruit. Of course, they end up facing consequences for crimes against their respective states. In particular, in Iran, you had cases of these defectors, of these double agents, being executed en masse. Now, a lot of the failures attributed, and you can see the editorializing when they get into this in a lot of these mainstream articles, that for the past 20, 30 years since the end of the Cold War, intelligence agencies have been focused on things like counterterrorism and fighting against insurgent groups like Al Qaeda, for example, and haven't paid that much attention, have put less of a priority on traditional espionage between state actors and, of course, state affiliated actors. And it is yet another blow to the credibility of the American empire. You have their top intelligence agency, something that gets blamed for a lot of things, which, in my personal opinion, is given way too much credit, because I'm not saying that they're completely incompetent, but I'm saying the CIA post 1991 especially is far more incompetent than I think most people would realize. Because it's easy to blame them for a lot of things until you realize, would they even be capable of that? Would they not completely botch that operation? Now, plenty of those you could say, well, yeah, they did that and they botched that operation, which I do frankly believe. And some could say their incompetence was actually in a way used to their advantage, because when you want to destabilize Syria, you just unleash the rabid dogs. It doesn't matter who they are. You're a rebel group. You're fighting for freedom. You're fighting for democracy. Whatever. You're armed by the CIA. You're armed by the Pentagon, to the point where you have CIA backed groups fighting each other, CIA groups fighting Pentagon backed groups, and it just gets more and more absurd as the story goes on. And really, with the CIA agents, it's not like a lot of this is recent news. There has been murmurings of this. We can go all the way back to, I think it was in 2018 when there was a story about a U.S. spy ring in Russia and China were busted around the same time, whereas Russia detained them and, again, took them prisoner, or in some case turncoated them, whereas China's response was just outright blanket executions of these captured agents. Now, one could say that's a difference between the cultures and the operating strategies of the respective countries, if you will, which I do think makes sense. Perhaps the Chinese didn't see much value in this ring that they busted to be used for leverage reasons, because it's not even necessarily a question of mercy, a question of doing the right thing, or sparing people. Sometimes it's a question of, well, sometimes it's more valuable to keep these people alive and keep them prisoner, whether we're going to use them as double agents to extract information or use them as bargaining chips if one of our assets gets caught in somewhere in the West. And you did see this a lot with the spats between particularly China and Canada over Huawei, over Chinese investments in Canada, where it wasn't necessarily intelligence agents, but whenever a Chinese person, a Chinese business figure, somebody in Canada like that would get detained, there was retaliations by arresting either an American or Canadian citizen, which I do think is a funny admission on China and, frankly, the world stage part that Canada isn't exactly viewed as a sovereign relevant country to the point where negotiations to free Canadians particularly took place with the American State Department with American assets, where the rest of the world does realize that, of course, the United States is an empire. A lot of these quote unquote sovereign countries are just really either colonies or client states, and of course, the joke is that Canada, it's the big irrelevant country, but it frankly kind of is. And no matter how much their population, their culture, their media may posture, really their identity is being that of an outgrowth of the United States, of American culture. And frankly, you could argue that a lot of modern Canadian identity, not to get off on too much of a tangent, is built on trying to be more American than Americans themselves. We're better at being liberal. We're better at following your values and principles. We're so much less racist, so much more tolerant, etc. This is a common thing throughout the Western world, and I would say throughout the Anglosphere, Canada in particular, with that idea trying to distinguish themselves from the United States. But getting back into the CIA, it just shows what I think we all knew, which was counterintelligence in the United States and protecting American assets abroad is severely lacking. And you could see this because just the number of, particularly in recent years, Chinese spy rings in the U.S. that had been operating for years, that took that long to be busted in these high positions, working in key sectors, working for major companies. One may think Boeing and Raytheon, these you know titans of the military industrial complex, in university positions. In fact, during the whole initial coronavirus crisis, when the question of the lab in China came up, one of the initial breaking pieces of news about that was in late February, early March of 2020, where you had, I think it was one of the big universities. It was one of the, I think it was MIT though, MIT or Harvard, one of those big institutions, where you had one of the professors there that worked in virology, of course, in that field, cooperating with, of course, Chinese nationals in the country, and those Chinese nationals, of course, returned to China. There was a detainment of the Americans involved, the Chinese involved, and that story was quickly swept under the rug, not even touched again. The point where, again, the narrative, not to get off on another tangent, about that was it was China and China alone. And you saw this early on with Trump with the China virus. Terrible Trump impression, but you'll have to overlook that. Rather than it being a sort of cabal, if you will. I know that word gets overused. I know that word has a certain connotation attached to it. But you had investors from all over the world, whether that be the U.S., France, China, etc., Canada, all cooperating on these research labs, on these things that are, frankly, I would say, in my own personal opinion, not to get too editorial again, beyond human capability to control and harness, and something that we're just really tempting fate when we play with these sort of things. And it's not even for the good of man or science or medicine. It's just for the thrill of playing God at the end of the day. And of course, that relates back to the fact that, I mean, the U.S. is more or less an open market for foreign influence and spies. I know this is a really tired talking point, but whether you want to go to foreign lobbies like APAC or whatever the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and Qatar have in the United States, the amount of Chinese influence, whether that be economically, intelligence, etc., when you get Dianne Feinstein's driver of 30 some years getting caught as a Chinese asset. Point being is American counterintelligence post Cold War and even during the Cold War has not been a pretty sight. And really, I think it is a reflection of the sort of post 1965 America that exists, or you could even say going back further, even to into 1940s America, with the origins of the OSS, which of course the wartime intelligence agency precursor to the CIA, the very questionable people we recruited there. The joke I always like to tell is that Trotsky just made another decade, he probably would have been director of the CIA. But again, going back into sort of the dysfunction of the American empire from the beginning and watching it all unravel, a lot of these things, in hindsight, make a lot of sense. A lot of these things are like, well, you should have seen that coming from a mile away. And I do think that while a lot of these stories aren't necessarily recent, just pointing these out and pointing out the series of these, whether it be the turncoats in China, the spies executed in Iran, etc., the spies detained in Russia, it just shows the glaring flaws of the American empire in all its glory, and that there's really no way around it. And it is almost vindicating for me. I'm, of course, not happy about this. I would prefer to live in a much more functional society, even if it was an empire. But really, it's just the epitome of the operating procedure of the American empire. These people always want to make it into this dichotomy. Oh, is it malice or is it just sheer incompetence and stupidity? And you could argue it's a combination of both, where the worst of both worlds really meets in those, and chaos ensues, and the modern American empire ensues. Now, moving on from that brief story, we do have something interesting that happens this week that I did want to touch on, and that was the brief internet outages on Monday, where you had particularly Facebook and several other websites and even phone providers such as Verizon experience shutdowns, experience these just major hiccups, and where it took down their websites, where it took down their programs for hours on end on Monday. Now, it does seem like that has resolved itself, and of course, speculation is flying. I do think more will be revealed as time goes on, but one of the other speculations that came out, which I thought was interesting, is possibly is this the development of an internet kill switch, so to speak. Now, you see this in places like Turkey, especially during the coup, where they have the ability to shut off access to entire websites and entire parts of the internet. And you see this employed in states like China. Now, I know this is an exact example. I'm not a tech guy, so my terminology may be very rudimentary here or just completely wrong. So if there's anyone who is more knowledgeable about technology or this sort of stuff, just please let me know. Of course, you had China's Great Firewall. You have the internet watchdog state apparatus in Russia, which I believe is Roskomnadzor, and they enforce Russian law on the internet inside Russia, whether that be uh, applying their speech codes or anti-pornography laws, or really, and what all intelligence agencies get down to, and this isn't really a knock at them. I mean, every country suppresses its dissidents, or else it wouldn't be a country. If there was true dissidence in any country, the regime would not exist. But again, I'm getting too far into a rabbit hole here. I don't really want to go down right now. See, this is why GSP is great. He keeps me tempered. He really bounces off of what I say well, and I think he has a lot of valuable contribution to the show. I mean, we're less than a half hour in. I'm about halfway through my stories. We'll probably get an hour out of this at most, so I hope you guys are enjoying the ride so far. I hope Constantine Martelli by himself is not unbearable without the great Macedonian one-man troll farm GSP himself, but getting back into this, one could speculate, and I've seen this thrown around as something I thought of when this first happened. Is this something of an internet kill switch? Are they testing something? Because, as we point out, unrest in the American empire and the Western world as a whole is only becoming greater and greater. And of course, with social media, they've really made the crackdown there, particularly after Trump's election with Facebook, Twitter, etc. A lot of these companies enforcing these new codes or employing censorship. Of course, you had the one strong-jawed woman, let's put it that way, in front of Congress this week on behalf of Facebook, really there in Zuckerberg's stead, doing the whole song and dance that they always do. And one could argue that due to the current instability of the empire now, I don't think we're on brink of collapse, despite some of the stuff I may say sometimes, but the dire straits we're in, one could speculate that as they anticipate things to get worse, they're preparing something that can shut down mass communications at the push of a button in order to stifle a lot of these movements. And one could point to the current unrest in Australia. Perhaps they're using that as a model, perhaps they're observing that as a situation on what would a mass unrest case in the Western world look like. Now, I'm not implying that Australia is undergoing these nationwide protests or anything like that, but I do think it is a pretty good bellwether, a contained model, if you will, of what is to come in the Western world. One could say the same about the Yellow Vests in France, who were admittedly very successful now. Of course, they were a few years earlier than this, before the crackdowns on everything really were cranked up. You could say in 2019 this really went into overdrive, and they really got concerned when you had a lot of significant figures on the internet being banned in late 2018, early 2019. A lot of voices that were very popular in the era of the Trump election, who some people say, due to that influence, helped get him elected. One may think somebody like an Alex Jones, just to give an example. But again, shutting down these minor but influential in their own right figures and their websites, and really places where people can congregate and share these ideas and form groups that might possibly grow into something in real life. Now, of course, again, I will always advocate for apathy. I think at this point, political activism, I think it's past the point where any sort of political activism can work, and you really just have to play it by ear and keep your head down and try to disengage from the system as much as possible. Now, I'm not saying there's no place for it, but I frankly don't personally advocate any action. I'm not here to be a leader. I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here more or less just to give an account of, hey, here's what's going on, and you guys seem to enjoy that, and I hope you continue to enjoy that, because I think that we've carved ourselves out quite a little nice operation here as time's going. And again, I am looking into alternatives. I'm looking into some other alternate platforms due to YouTube's sort of heavy-handed policies, to say the least. And I'll certainly keep you guys posted on other places where you can watch the show if you don't want to give YouTube your business, or if worse comes to worse and we're no longer on this website for whatever reason. And getting back on track, and just in the topic of tech censorship and the internet kill switch, one could say, I mean, really, it's one of those cases. I see these things all the time when I do this show, where it's well, that's really bad if it's what they say it is, or it's really bad if it's what they don't say it is, where they put themselves in a no-win situation where either I'm supposed to believe that these tech companies are so incompetent that somebody was able to hack them to this degree, an internal saboteur was able to do this, or there was just a system failure due to random events to that degree, or that they're deliberately testing things on it, that they're playing games with us, that they're playing games with their own websites, with populations for possible future actions. Because either way, neither of those look good. And it goes back to that whole incompetence stupidity question. Maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe they were playing around with their kill switch system and took a little too far and whatever. But it certainly was an interesting story. It was a very brief blip on the radar. Most people have seemed to have forgotten about it by this point. But of course, it does coincide with interesting news about the you know what's, the mandatory you know what's coming out with some of these companies being put under scrutiny. Even countries in Scandinavia, Sweden in particular, saying, well, maybe there's things that we're overlooking about this, and suspending requirements or suspending administering of this treatment to particularly teenage boys. And again, it makes you wonder, targeting teenage boys, men in their early 20s, the people who are the figurative and literal foot soldiers of society, the ones who are, again, you could say that men from the age range of 18 to 35, the people doing the manual labor, the people really that make up the sort of backbone of society, at least in that sense. You could wonder why it might seem strange to some people that they're the ones who might be disproportionately affected, particularly when it comes to the teenage boys or just teenagers in general. Now, again, I'm not getting into any medical advice. I'm not getting into any medical science, but I figured that was an interesting coinciding of events. Now, looking at other topics I had here, I'll just touch briefly on some of the internal news in the United States. So, the countdown to October 18th, unfortunately, that did start last week, has been canceled. It looks like there has been some renegings at the last minute in order to get us out of going over the fiscal cliff, as I'm sure many of you remember that phrase from, I believe it was 2011, 2012, the fiscal cliff, the fiscal cliff, the fiscal cliff. And one of the proposed ideas that actually came out of this, which I found humorous, was the fabled $1 trillion coin. We just need to mint the $1 trillion coin. And it looks like even Janet Yellen, head of the Treasury, acknowledged that herself. But it looks like, as I expected, economic crisis has been averted for now. Now the can has been kicked down the road, and really, again, it all goes back to the American empire. The U.S. dollar, the American economy, is worth as much as it can enforce on the world stage. The joke is the U.S. dollar it's backed by military might. It is backed by the nuclear weapons, backed by the aircraft carrier. People trade in that because the American military and the American empire is the predominant force in the world. Now, as geopolitical shifts take place, as the current ones that are taking place continue on their current trajectories, I think you'll see less and less of that. But as we referenced last week, and I believe even the week before, the last time America prints $1 billion and there's no substantial change to the economy, then that's how you know it's over. That's how you know things have been lost in that end. But more interesting is you have numerous ships, cargo ships, on both the East Coast and the West Coast that are anchored offshore that aren't being unloaded. Now, that of course is due to pandemic restrictions, lack of a workforce, people outside of the workforce, of course. There's been labor shortages all across the country, which has led to supply shortages in both necessary goods. For example, people are fear mongering about the dreaded toilet paper shortages again, and of course, consumer goods and luxury goods. And the advice that's been going around is, oh, do your Christmas shopping early because it's going to be tight this year. And it looks like for whatever reason, whether that be, again, the gross incompetence or the malice of the American empire, or maybe somewhere in between, that you have all these cargo ships sitting off the shore of the United States, whether that be West Coast, whether that be East Coast, and that goods shortages are taking place. And I don't think it's going to be a severe economic crisis. I don't think we've reached that levels yet. I don't even think it's going to be severe shortages. It's going to be noticeable, similar to inflation, but it's not going to be something that can really break people's perception of security. That is one of the key things holding the American empire together. No matter how disillusioned people get, no matter how much they might hate Biden or Trump or whoever, or whatever political side or whatever key political issue is on the table now, so long as they lead comfortable and secure lives, they won't generally oppose the regime. Now, we saw the breakdown of more of the security side of law and order with policing and crime rates in the country over 2020, where we actually had a spike in violent crime as opposed to the general downward trend since the 1990s, since 1994 in particular. And of course, that's led to a lot of people trying to get out of the cities and abandonment of that. Abandonment by those businesses. A lot of the businesses that got destroyed are not reestablishing themselves in the places where the demonstrations and the riots took place. So it's not an entire breakdown of a sense of security in the United States, but there is that. And of course, the other factor that not only physical security from things such as violent crime, but economic security. The feeling that, well, where's our next meal going to come from? Is our next consumer good going to come from? How are we going to continue on our day-to-day life with the comfort level that we've been accustomed to for the past 30 years? And it looks like people are starting to feel a dull pain when it comes to that. Nothing that has freaked anyone out yet. You could see that there hasn't been protests or riots or unrest due to the fact that consumer or even everyday goods have seen a rise in price and a shortage. Now, one could only anticipate, and I frankly do, that this situation will only escalate over time and that we will only see this become more and more intense as time goes on. But it is just quite a comical sight, almost in the level of that ship stuck in the Suez Canal, all these ships just anchored off the U.S. coast, just with all these consumer goods. And at that point, it's not even a supply shortage because they're right there. It's a distribution problem. It's a logistics problem of actually getting these things, from point A to point B. But I think the supply shortages are going to become an issue in the near future. I think we saw a brief taste of that in 2020, especially when the crisis started in East Asia, in particular China, when people thought China was going to be shut down for months on end, which frankly it wasn't. They actually managed to, I hate to say it, maneuver it better than we did. Same with a lot of other East Asian countries. Looks like the place where this really got taken overboard. Not a place outside the Western world, in particular the Anglosphere. Won't say the UK and Australia and blue state America are probably the worst about that, even though I'd say there's some pretty heavy contenders in places like France, but just the Western world in general. And I think it's a taste of what's to come economically, but moving on to some more interesting news in that regard, we have some European news regarding a diplomatic dispute between the U.S. and Russia, if you want to call it a dispute, a catfight, if you will, between the major powers, which I suppose is nothing new. We haven't really seen anything like this in a few years now, not since, I would say at least 2018 was the last time you had this pretty big flare-up. And from RT, so take it with a grain of salt, U.S. senators want to boot out 300 Russian diplomats over embassy row, but Moscow says it doesn't even have that many in Washington. So, we've seen since Skripal, since, of course, Ukraine, you could say is the big one, but everything subsequent to Ukraine, every time Russia has done something that has been disapproved of, for lack of a better term, you've seen the mass expulsion of diplomats. You've seen dozens upon dozens of countries recalling their diplomats or expelling Russian diplomats. You had, particularly in 2017, when the Michael Flynn story was big, the whole debacle, the whole hubbub with Kislyak, the Russian ambassador, and his meetings with Trump and his talking to American officials, and for a brief few months, it seemed like everyone in the American media, everyone in the American pundit class and political class knew who Sergei Kislyak was and how he was one of the most important people in the United States at that time, despite the fact that, again, just a Russian bureaucrat, a Russian diplomat, ambassador to the United States, of course, but you do have more of the overt tensions, more of the tit-for-tat sort of game that's been going on between the U.S. and Russia coming back to a forefront that really, I would say, went dormant in 2019. Now, of course, it's not like that ceased. You saw in the wake of the Navalny case, particularly with European countries, there were these sort of spats of recalling and expelling diplomats from respective countries. Of course, they tried to blame that one explosion. I believe it was either the it was in the Eastern Czech Republic of this old arms depot that was built during the Soviet era, trying to say that Russian saboteurs attacked it and were trying to destabilize the Czech Republic or undermine the integrity of the European Union, NATO, blah 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 blah, etc. And really, it's coming back to a forefront. I suppose you could say a lot of this is irrelevant. I just thought it was humorous that the Russians outright said it's like we don't even have that diplomats to expel at this point, and I mean it's frankly the case we're really running on bare bones embassy staff in both these countries. Now, I wouldn't say U.S.-Russian relations are particularly failing. I think they're in the same sour state they've been for almost the past 9, 10 years at this point. Again, you could say the Maidan Crimea, if you want to go all the way back to Georgia. But it's not surprising that out of a Biden administration in particular, and I'm really surprised it took this long, that these sort of spats are coming to the forefront once again. And I don't think it's of much significance that the U.S. and Russia are having these feuds, that are having these disputes. But it does seem like almost a, pardon the phrase, return to normal, that these things are being publicized again by particularly the American side and even, you could say, the Russian side. Now, moving on from that, you have the current energy crisis in Europe, across the world really, but in Europe in particular. And this, of course, has been something that has gone hand in hand with the question of Nord Stream 2 of the pipeline. Now, due to, of course, economic shutdowns from the last year, even stretching into the beginning of this year, energy production was curtailed. You had the Gulf states, the OPEC states, raising oil prices, and you also had, inside the United States, a major energy producer and exporter. You had the Keystone Pipeline getting the axe when Biden came to office. One of the first things he did, which shot up energy prices. The suspension of fracking operations across the United States, which again helped shoot up gas prices and energy prices in general. And then going back to Hurricane Ida from a month and a half ago, that curtailed a lot of the production of Gulf oil and energy. No surprise, of course, the oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico and in the southern United States, southeastern United States, were affected by the storm and still are not fully up to snuff as they once were. And we see this continuing on. This seems to be a continuing trend, and you do see Russia countering this with things like Nord Stream, with things like their energy deal with Hungary. And you even had state representatives come out to Gazprom and say, well, let's not do the Ukrainians too dirty. Let's not completely divert energy and gas transportation through Ukraine. So, while it was never officially suspended, while it was only largely curtailed, it does look like that despite everything, and perhaps this is an unwise move, perhaps this is a genius move, I suppose time will tell, it doesn't look like that Russia plans on cutting off energy transit through Ukraine entirely. Now, I suppose you could get more siphonings, and we'll see how that goes, but I think the main accomplishment of Nord Stream 2 and to a lesser extent Turk Stream is that not that they necessarily wanted to pull out of Ukraine in that sense, but it gives them alternatives to the point where Ukraine isn't the only point of transit that they have to rely on, that they're screwed without. Because, of course, they have the North Sea now, they have the northern European countries that cooperate with Nord Stream 2, they have Turk Stream, which, of course, Turkey and the Balkans, that this pipeline has been built. And you do see this playing out where Nord Stream has helped alleviate some of the energy costs in Europe. It seems like Europe, who has really been starved for its own energy, and even East Asia to an extent are experiencing shortages. People are saying it's going to be a cold, cold winter in both a figurative and literal sense when it comes to energy prices. That a lot of industry is going to take a hit because of this, and I do think that what we do see is again something of a time to come. Now, just to put in perspective, for natural gas, records were broken for reaching 1600. So I did slightly lie to you guys. I wasn't without a co-host. I mean, my dogs were a studio audience for this, as they are sometimes. But they get a little rowdy sometimes. But getting back to what I was saying, you had record-breaking uh, gas per cubic meter price is breaking 1600 per 1,000, and as of yesterday, October 6th, you had it at 1400 per 1,000. Now, it is a volatile market at this point. It is something, again, I'm no investment expert, I'm no genius on these sort of things, but I suppose according to our good friend Vile Varangian, who has some shares, that Gazprom stocks are doing well. So that's not a surprise. And really, I do think you're going to start to see where pragmatism is going to win the day yet again in Europe when it comes to it being at the crossroads of the American empire, of the Atlantic system, and of Russia, China, and the so called Eurasian system, where sure, they would like to shun the illiberal countries like Russia, like China, and condemn the dictators like Putin and Xi Jinping, but when it comes to putting bread on the table, or more appropriately, turning on the heat during the cold winter night, I think they can overlook some of those ideological condemnations, overlook some of those higher principles, so to speak. Now, I'm not saying that Europe is going to become this bastion of illiberalism, as wonderful as that would be, but I do think they're going to take a more of a blind eye approach. And we saw the election outcome in Germany. France has an election coming up, and of course, their election is going to be in the spring of 2022. And there are other, of course, various smaller European countries that will have political upheaval in elections between now and then, or between then and now, if you will. But it will be interesting to see how much people will vote with their wallet and vote with their winter heating, so to speak, where you have it, they may overlook, again, ideological or other concerns for sheer pragmatism. Oh, this party's going to bring gas prices down, this party's going to bring energy prices down. Oh, so what? They have to cooperate with Russia, etc. I'll take it. And I do think that at the end of the day, the era of unlimited prosperity, of having whatever you want at your fingertips, I don't think we're out of that era yet. I still think that we still live in a very productive society that can produce these necessities and these consumer luxury goods that people do want and that people do ask for and that people do frankly demand. But I do foresee this becoming a worldwide trend of the reality of scarcity of goods and resources actually becoming an immediate reality for most people. Of course, most people understand these concepts in the abstract. They understand that, well, there's not an infinite source of everything, but the way they live their lives and the way that their societies and economies are structured, it does create the perception that, of course, these things are infinite, these things are easily accessible, etc. And as time goes on, as the world becomes less and less of the neoliberal paradise, I do think people will start to realize that this isn't the way it's always going to be. This isn't the way that works. This prosperity is, okay, I should clarify this. Economic prosperity is a very finite thing that you have to hit the right spot to capture, and something that we cannot continue into perpetuity. Now, with all that being said, I do think, pardon the pun, as I keep saying, this will lead to a thawing of relations between Europe and Russia, and even Europe and Iran. And you could attribute some of the energy shortages to the scrapping or the disruption of the JCPOA. Now, I know that's very old news, it's like 2018, but we could see how that works out. And one could say, at this point, this really hinges on OPEC and OPEC aligned countries in order to try to bring those oil and gas prices down. Particularly, one would think Saudi Arabia, which we'll see how that goes because you'll recall, I mean, just a year and a half ago, you had the U.S. you had us in the U.S. and across the world witnessing a Saudi Russian price war when it came to oil drilling, and to the point where oil actually went down into the negatives. And people were speculating that that was going to happen again. It doesn't look like that has happened ever since. It looked like that was very just brief moment in time. In fact, I think it was just about 36 hours of the markets, really about a day and a half, where that actually happened. And one could say it's inevitable to happen again. It's just the way these things work, that they will get into another price war and things will get driven down, at least temporarily. But U.S. reserves in particular are, while we did stock up from that price war, again, they've reached shortages. There's concerns about stockpiles and reserves in other countries as well. So, again, it will be interesting to see how the dynamics of energy play out. And one could wonder if nuclear as a concept will start to regain popularity, of course, after Germany decommissioned their plants after Fukushima in 2011. And do you know who else is a big exporter of nuclear power plant technology? That's right, Russia. So I guess we'll see how those markets play out. And I don't know, maybe they will come to their senses on that. Now again, I don't believe nuclear is this catch-all energy source. I think oil and gas is still much more efficient, but it's stupid not to diversify, at least in that sense. But all I have left for you right now is some news out of East Asia, particularly Taiwan. Now, tensions have been slowly rising between China and Taiwan, and American involvement and Western involvement. Particularly after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, you saw where a lot of American allies were feeling much less secure in their prospects in America's ability to guarantee their security after the American quote-unquote betrayal of the Afghan national government. And Taiwan was one of the key countries that was brought into question. And you've seen this massive effort in the American media, particularly American conservative media, to save face when it comes to Taiwan, to talk about the vitality of Taiwan's security and sovereignty and protecting the Taiwanese, a country that we still don't even recognize as an official country. We still maintain that the People's Republic of China is officially China since the 1970s. Now, whether that's a good or bad thing, whether we should recognize one or both, I mean, frankly, at this point, does it really matter with the current state of the American empire's internal affairs? I don't think our recognition is going to mean much in a decade, but Taiwan is functionally recognized by the United States, by most Western countries, even though it may not be official. And of course, this is all in a lead up to the revelation that American special forces have been operating in Taiwan at least for a year. Now, apparently, many in Congress were in the dark about this, and one could only speculate that this has been ongoing for far more than a year, probably dating back to the Obama pivot to Asia. You've had American military operations in Taiwan. Now, the last explicit military operation involving Taiwan I can recall, now correct me if I'm wrong, was in the 90s with the Taiwan Strait crisis, where we actually sailed the carriers through the straits. That was under Bill Clinton. But this came as a shock to some, and something that was obvious to many, that we had been gearing up for some sort of at least asymmetrical confrontation with China. I don't think we're on the war path with China quite yet, but you could say there's plenty of elements of that, and there's plenty of elements that were at least engaged in a Cold War or sort of impending proxy war with China, particularly on the question of Taiwan. And China has also gotten more bold with their flyovers into their airspace because, I mean, of course, you do have to realize that the official claim of the PRC is that this is just a province that is under the control of separatists, that's under the control of breakaway forces, and that it is part of the PRC itself. And that this isn't a violation of anyone's airspace, as this is their airspace. And the question is, and we've speculated on it, and of course there's all the theories and speculations, is like, oh, when is China going to take Taiwan? Have they made a back deal with Biden? Is one that really far out there takes that came up, but I mean, that's the question. China has to be impeccable about their timing in this because it has to be the final move. It has to be the checkmate, so to speak, of the American empire. Where if they act far too soon, it's going to provoke a major conflict. It's going to provoke more backlash than they could probably handle at this point. But if they strike at the precise moment, at the right moment, it's something that is going to send the American empire, at least in East Asia, falling down like a house of cards, where it proves it's incompetent, proves it's a paper tiger, etc. Now, when that day will come, I don't know, but I don't think that China, especially under its current leadership, is going to throw away years of meticulous planning for a rash seizing of Taiwan. Some people have tried to very haphazardly compare to this the Crimea situation, in which case there's not a comparison beyond the fact that it's a seizure of a territory that was formerly part of this country. But I mean, Crimea, you had Russian troops there even after the fall of the Soviet Union. You've had them there since the late 18th century. You had a referendum in the parliament. You had the troops that were in the province already restoring order. Whereas China hasn't had control of Taiwan since the 1940s. This is a completely different situation altogether. And people love to speculate on this. And of course, it's becoming where Taiwan is getting that same status that they give Israel and arguably even India, where it's our greatest ally. Without them, we would be nothing. There are the thin line between order and chaos for America. They're the first line of defense, keeping us safe from the CCP, from the Chinese communists. Similar to how Israel's keeping us safe from Iran and the Islamic terrorists and blah 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 blah. But you see them building up this rhetoric right now, and it's really falling on deaf ears. Nobody it really seems to be that concerned about Taiwan, at least in the American general public or the general public of the American empire, including its proxy states. It seems to be a very beltway conservative idea. It seems to be a very mainstream conservative idea, and something to establish this rebranding of neoconservatism about protecting this East Asian satellite when really there are so many mounting problems within the heartland of the empire that to most people it doesn't even matter. It's this idea that the integrity of your outer wall is of the utmost importance when a plague had already ravaged the city within the walls and had pretty much crippled it and its people beyond repair. Like you have this, what's inside is been reduced to rubble through internal means, through things that didn't come from outside the walls, but maintain the integrity of the wall against the foreign barbarian seems to be the number one priority at this point. And even this, I would say, not particularly threatening foreign threat. Now, I'm not saying that China wants to sit down with all the world powers and play nice or whatever, but in terms of them as a direct threat to the United States, I mean, this isn't Hawaii we're talking about. This isn't even Guam we're talking about. We're talking about Taiwan. And the idea that Taiwan is just the key to the puzzle of all of this is frankly much more of an American perspective. And you could almost say the Chinese dedication to taking Taiwan back, of course, plays up to the nationalist crowd, plays up to that. But one could say it's almost to get egg on the face of the Americans. I'm not saying there would be no benefit in taking back Taiwan. Of course, that superconductor production, I'm entirely sure what a superconductor is, but You figure putting some of our most vital production, if superconductors are really that important, somewhere like Taiwan rather than somewhere a bit more secure. Maybe, some may even say in the United States, where can work to the American domestic economy, may be beneficial. But the idea that, of course, Taiwan is this key to the puzzle for Chinese world domination is again much more an idea of the Americans. Like I said, certainly benefits to it, but I would say China's main reason for taking back Taiwan is more to deal blown credibility to the empire. Perhaps not the main reason, but I think that plays much more of a factor than a lot of the practical reasons would. Because China seemed to fare just fine without Taiwan when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, when it comes to their expansion of their economy and trade, and frankly, as a military force, their navy is nothing to sneeze at either. It's not anything unimpressive. It certainly doesn't compete with the American Navy, at least in theory, at this point. But we saw those 2018 war games, those hypersonic missiles. So who knows? But that's all I had for this shorter episode of the War Report this week. I hope I didn't miss any details. I know GSP usually has a lot to contribute, and that's cutting us about a half hour short. But I hope you guys enjoyed this solo episode with the addition of my managing mutts. Of course, they felt the need to contribute for a little bit there, but hey, that's okay, I suppose. And we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.